in this episode with Lee Murray.
You know, the Asian community is one of the biggest growing, fastest growing communities in New Zealand. We have a lot of, new Asian immigrants. I mean, I'm born here, my mum's born here, but, there are a lot of new immigrants and they're facing lots of these things. There's prejudice around our food and the way we speak and, the way we drive, can we back a trailer, all of those stereotypical things. Actually, I remember at age 10 reading Gone with the Wind, and just an epic story. And I said to my dad, I'd really like to be a writer one day. And he said, you should probably get a real job first. So I went on and became a research scientist because I needed a real job first, because he said, you're never going to make a living as a writer. And you know what? Dad was right. It's really, 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 really hard to make a living as a writer, especially in New Zealand. I mean, I have yet to make minimum wage as a writer, having written full-time for 15 years.
Okay.
And sometimes, I'm doing 60-hour weeks. And so it's, I could go to the grocery store and earn more probably. I don't think you can regret your life choices to a certain extent. They are what they are, and it's to make the most of what they are. Why don't you do it? Why don't you stop talking about it? Why don't you stop talking about writing and just jolly well do it?
How long you were talking about doing it for, why you were talking about it, what was driving you towards wanting to do that, but also what was preventing you from that?
Yeah, that's probably a really good question. And I think it's probably me, that whole self-doubt, imposter syndrome. But in my head, I write the beginning often, I write the end, I know kind of where it's going, I might have some major plot points, but basically it's magic. It kind of happens when I sit down and it's magic. I still think it's magic. I still don't know how I do it. And I am a USA Today bestselling author, but that is for 1 week on the USA Today charts. That is 1 week of sales and not forever sales. So for once, if you're a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, 5 times you've got on that 1 week list. It doesn't represent necessarily of sales across the rest of the year. It might be release day sales or something like that. So I think there's this kind of, well, yes, bestselling is great. Don't, I'm not knocking that at all. But I think people don't quite understand that actually writing, even very successful writers may be really struggling to make ends meet financially, because we get maybe $1 for every book sold.
So Lee, thank you for joining us today and giving up some time to come and talk to us about your life's work. And if I can, I'd like to start with that question actually of how would you summarize what your life's work is?
That's a good question. I call myself a writer. So I guess that's where I feel my life's work is. And I hope that people will remember me as a kind writer. Kindness is kind of my my underlying personal mantra, my ethic. And so when I'm remembered in the future, I hope people will say, she was that horror writer and she was really kind. So, yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, so as you know, this podcast is about life, work, and legacy. And so in relation to your life's work, what I'd like to be able to do now really is maybe go back in time to when you were younger, to try and create some context about who, how you became a writer, because that's not all you've done. So it'd be interesting to explore what's gone on in the past that's brought you to where you are today. So if you could, just talk to me about maybe your childhood, where you were raised, the circumstances under which you were raised, and what kind of character were you as a young Lee?
Okay, so I'm nearly 60 now, so I'm old. I was born in Putaruru, and I am a third generation Chinese New Zealander on one side, and sort of some Welsh and Spanish and European, English heritage on the other side, going back to, I think, the late 1700s. So some early settlers here in New Zealand, colonizers in New Zealand, I should say. And I think, to be honest, I was kind of one of those first sort of mixed marriage children of Asian and European descent. So I didn't see anyone really like me apart from my brothers and sisters, and there were four of us. So we lived in Taupua, Whangarei. Dad moved around, he was in the bank, I guess, as a sort of mixed race kiddie, I just didn't see anybody like myself, but I had great siblings, we had great fun, Dad was a brilliant storyteller himself. We'd go on road trips to Wellington to see my mother's family, and all the way Dad would entertain us with these little stories about, I used to tell these funny stories about my little cousin who had missed the car and wanted to come on this trip with us, and she's running along behind us, and oops, she's leapt over a cow, and now she's running through a house. Great fun little stories, setting up all these barriers to the protagonist, which was my little cousin. I don't know if she knows this. I must tell her sometime. And to me, actually, now that I look back, he was just telling us how to tell a story. So you have a character who wants something, a motivation. I want to get with you and go on this trip, and then as the story proceeds, you throw up these barriers and see how the character will test themselves and how they will, get around these barriers in order to achieve their goals. And that's just great storytelling. That's just storytelling, And so we would jump in and say, oh, no, Dad, look, there's some bumblebees or something. We would throw in our own little ideas of what might happen next, because that's kind of what storytelling is about, is what next, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? How will they respond? And so my child was full of stories and how to tell stories. I didn't realize he was teaching us how to tell stories back in the day. And he told great stories. Dad died in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, so it was really tough. But he was great at reading to us. Every night he read to us, he did all the best voices, and he made up great stories of his own, just really fun things that kids love. Like, he would tell us stories about two little frogs who lived at the bottom of Dip Road in Whangarei, which has a sort of gully, and for people who know Whangarei, and at the bottom there was this little creek, and he would tell these stories about two little frogs called Horace and Aristotle, who lived in I didn't know who Horace and Aristotle were in those days, but they were really dumb, these frogs. They were really stupid. They would do stupid things. They were a little bit like sort of Ernie and Bert characters, from Sesame Street.
Yeah.
One was, a bit straight-laced and we should do this, but they were both pretty stupid. But in the end, they always made it out of this predicament. Like even when you're a little frog, crossing the road is a tricky thing to do, right? And so they would be, not looking at the traffic, and then one of them would pull the other one back. Don't jump yet, there's a car coming. Those kinds of things. Or how are we going to get, up? How are two little frogs going to get up on the counter at the dairy to get an ice cream? That kind of really like simple problems, and how they use teamwork to sort of sort it out. And I love those stories. They almost, yeah. And he would tell stories about Professor Morgan. His name was Morgan, so of course he put himself in the story. He was Professor Morgan, who invented amazing things in his garage out of ice cream container lids and, bits of sticks and screws and bits of junk. And then his amazing Zizbert machine, Zizbert, it made that sound when it moved along. And could do all sorts of things. It could go under the water, and it could fly, and it could go into space. And he would tell us these adventures about this inventive chap called Professor Morgan. So my storytelling life started with my dad, I think, and perhaps, and I have to say that now my storytelling life has progressed to my mum,
Right.
Because my mum, of course, she's a sort of quiet little Asian lady, but absolutely a powerhouse and very intelligent, and now I'm, her heritage kind of got sort of stepped back in our childhood because we were Kiwi, we were living in New Zealand and trying to fit in and belong, and so now I'm looking back to those stories of my mum's and asking her questions and finding out more about her heritage so I can put it in my horror writing, and so it's kind of, I think as I've progressed I've sort of come around to sort of thinking about all of those aspects of myself and not just that very Kiwi upbringing that I had, with
Sure.
bare feet and ice creams and summers and, the things that we did as children.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. Can I ask you? I mean, we'll come back to your mum's side of things, because that's, like you said, it's featuring in your writing, and you've written about, being an Asian horror writer. As I've researched before this interview. So if we can, we'll come back to that. I just want to go back to your dad a second. What drove him to tell those stories, or where did his storytelling ability come from? Was it just a natural thing, or did?
Yeah, I think it might have been a natural thing for Dad. I mean, he came from a family of teachers, and so, and he had thought at one point he might be a teacher.
Okay.
But he ended up going to the Navy and into the bank, and then he was in safety. He did lots of things, jumped around and did a few things. I think he just maybe was a bit of a natural. But I mean, everything is story, isn't it? Our whole lives are stories. We sit around the table, we tell our stories of our day. I mean, I think everything is stories somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about his imagination.
Yeah.
It's quite special, really.
I guess it is, isn't it? Yeah. I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky to have had that opportunity. I think, comedians are a bit the same, aren't they? They sort of take a real life thing and sort of adapt it to make a fun anecdote or story and look at the underlying truth. And I think that so perhaps funny people and very intelligent funny people probably have that storytelling sort of gene as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you said there were four of you.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got siblings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's the makeup of that? Brothers, sisters?
I'm the eldest.
You're the eldest?
I'm the eldest. We've got two boys in the middle, and I have a baby sister as well.
Right. Okay. And so, what was? I mean, you've touched on the fact that you didn't see anyone else that looked like you around. What was that like growing up back then, being mixed raced? Was that difficult for you? Did it cause
Yeah, I think
issues?
Mum and Dad did a great job of looking out for us, and making us feel like we were loved and it didn't really matter. And if, and it's just those occasional things, the racist comments and things like that. And yeah, I think Mum and Dad did a really good job. We didn't really sort of know how different we were, if you
Mm,
like,
yeah.
until, later on you sort of start to put things together and just feel a little bit different. I think, when it comes to reading though, I didn't see any little Kiwi Asian girls in anything at all, ever.
Mm,
It's hard not to see yourself in writing. Representation really, really matters. And I talk a lot about that a little bit in my poetry collection, Tortured Willows, because, when the movie Mao's Last Dancer came out, my mother took me to see it. She said, "You have to come and see this movie." And I said, okay. So I went along with her to watch it, and there was this tiny little clip of a little toddler, I don't know, 3 years old, using a set of bellows to keep the fire going in this little hut in a village somewhere in China. Now, my mother is born in New Zealand. She was born in Christchurch. But as a young girl, she went back to China in the late 40s. So after the war years, um, and she said that was her role. That was her job as a tiny little girl before she was 5 years old, was to keep the bellows going, to keep the fire going. When she was when she visited China, she was one of 9 children. So, yeah, that representation really, really matters. Now, my mum, I think, went to see that movie 3 times that week that it came out,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
just to see that little clip, because that was her.
yeah.
And it's not even a movie about New Zealand,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think we really do need stories about ourselves. I mean, maybe that's why Dad put himself in the story about, Professor Morgan and his Zizbert, because Dad was a bit of an inventor. He did make things in the garage. He would be pottering around in there. He could fix a bike with, a piece of, the tab off a Coke can or something. He was full of great inventions. So maybe that was it. Maybe Dad wanted to see himself a bit more in a story, so he put himself in there, and said these things are possible. We can do things just if we just use our ingenuity. So yeah.
I don't know really where I'm going with this, but I'm intrigued and curious. That's just my nature. So, I'm also maybe fairly ignorant, so forgive me. But the representation thing, it's maybe something because if you're not a minority, you just take for granted, and you don't really think about that.
Mm.
How big a thing is that?
It's a big deal. Yeah, it's a big deal. It's interesting. I think about I think back to when I was young, and my mother didn't really take us to the doctor. Dad used to take us to the doctor, because I think Mum, as a little Asian woman, got this, well, there, dear, this is not how we do it. But Dad, as a European man with, a background in health science and things like that, they listened to him. They listened to him. So there's just these little things that you do, that he would do in order to, like, I have to look back and say I did have a lot of privilege just because my dad was European. And it's a wonderful thing to have these different cultures in your family. But for my mother, for example, she eloped to marry my dad, because you didn't marry a European boy, you didn't. And in those days, she was very brave. She was very brave. She risked being ostracized from her family. And she had an arranged marriage organised for her, and which she didn't follow through with. And he's a lovely man, but it just wasn't for her, I've met him since. He is a lovely man, but he just wasn't for my mum. And so, so for her to have done that, and believe me, she's 5 foot tall, no, she's 5 foot tall on her tippy toes. And so, for her to just be so courageous to take the stand and say, I'm going to marry who I choose to, that was a big thing. So, there are these small things. They're small things, but they're massive. They're massive.
Mm.
So I think Mum and Dad protected me a lot from that. I have the privilege of having a dad who could walk around as a European man, and man as well, not a little Asian lady, who just gave me that access into that space, I guess. Yeah.
So we're talking about a different time, really, when
Yes,
your mum
we are.
chose to do that. Again, just interested in your thoughts. How different is it now? It feels different to me, but then I'm ignorant of this stuff. I'm not really experiencing it from the same perspective. So
I think COVID was interesting because there was just a lot of rhetoric around, the China virus. And so if you look like me, that's a tricky space to be in. And I have lots of colleagues and friends from different places in the world, Asian diaspora people, friends, who really faced a lot of prejudice. So there was kind of a lot of anti-Asian sentiment online and that kind of thing. I did feel that. So yes, there are some things that have exacerbated that, but also from my perspective, perhaps that may have made a big difference to me because my anthology, Black Cranes, which I co-edited with Genevieve Flynn, an Australian, Malaysian, Chinese, Australian, that particular work just exploded. The response to it was incredible. It's full of stories by Asian diaspora women writing horror, and I think the fact that there was this anti-Asian sentiment worldwide because of the pandemic, there was also this response where we want to know more. Why is there this sentiment towards Asian people? And it was a great place. And horror is very subversive, transgressive. It's effective. It makes you feel things. And so it's a great place to explore those kinds of things, and in a sort of safety, because when you put yourself in fiction, there's that layer of safety. It's you're writing your perspectives, but you're writing them from the point of view of your characters. So there's this little element of safety, but also there's this wonderful opportunity to say, well, look, there are other ways through this, because the thing about horror is that you're approaching it as, we're looking at demons, we're looking at the things that concern us, that cause fear. But when you see the resolution of the story, even if it doesn't work out for the character, you think, well, I won't do that. There's a way through. There's at least some kind of resolution. And I think particularly if you think about the pandemic, if you've read any zombie fiction, you should have known what was going to happen in the pandemic. There would be people that would break the curfew. There would be, the lockdowns. There would be, people who would deny the science. There would be all of that. We know that because speculative fiction and horror is really good for sort of looking forward and saying, what are we going to be facing? And looking at the things that really frighten us. So kind of that's how I sort of developed into. Yeah. I don't know where I got off. I've got off track. Oh, what was the question again?
So, it was about are things different these days?
Yeah.
And I think maybe I'm taking. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's different now, but it's still a thing. It's still an issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's still a thing, and it is still a thing. Yeah. Yes, it is still a thing, But that said, I think we've made great progress. Yeah. And anytime you make great progress, you often get a bit of pushback, don't you? So so I'm, very excited. And of course, we have a lot of, the Asian community is one of the fastest growing communities in New Zealand. We have a lot of, new Asian immigrants. I mean, I'm born here, my mum's born here. But, there are a lot of new immigrants and they're facing lots of these these things. There's prejudice around our food and the way we speak, and the way we drive. Can we back a trailer? All of those stereotypical things. Are you a dragon mum at school? Are you one of those tiger mums that hovers around? There are these kind of stereotypes, and also that whole there's a lot of stereotypes around Asian women, the sexualizing of Asian women. You're a geisha, or you're a concubine, or some kind of sexualized person, or you will be submissive and lie down and just kind of accept, be a doormat, or subsume yourself into the service of everybody else. There are a lot of tropes around it. In fact, Black Cranes came about because two Asian girls. So Genevieve and I were at, I was invited to GenreCon in Australia as a guest, and I turned up, conscientious Asian girl. I turned up early to the panel, and the only other person who was there early was this other conscientious Asian girl, both writers of horror. And I had heard about Genevieve in various circles because we write horror, which is unusual for Asian girls. And she said, oh, we're both here early to the panel. And so we got chatting about the very fact that we had, fallen into that traditional trope of Asian girls being very hardworking and ethical and punctual and all of those things. So we started talking about, how we accepted those traditions and also rejected them in some ways. And who else was writing about those things? And that kind of was the kernel which started the ball rolling for Black Cranes. And that led to, after the success of Black Cranes, we wrote Tortured Willows, which was a poetry collection, a collaborative poetry collection between 4 Asian women horror writers. And now Unquiet Spirits has just come out, which is a collection of essays by Asian women in horror, looking at the spiritual aspects, the fox spirits and the hungry ghosts, and the various types of urban ghosts and monsters that impact our everyday lives. Because, of course, mythology, there's a reason for those myths and ideas and faiths and ghost stories, if you like, and why they're told, because they intend for us to behave in a certain way. So this group of Asian women horror writers have talked about how those impact on our everyday lives.
Right. Wow. That's good. Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm interested in knowing more about the influence of your mum. If we can go back to your childhood again, because I want to sort of move through how you got to writing.
I got to writing.
Yeah.
I could tell you a story about that, Steve, because actually I remember at age 10 reading Gone with the Wind, and just an epic story. And I said to my dad, I'd really like to be a writer one day. And he said, you should probably get a real job first. So I went on and became a research scientist because I needed a real job first, because he said, you're never going to make a living as a writer. And you know what? Dad was right. It's really, 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 really hard to make a living as a writer, especially in New Zealand. So, so that's the little story about that. So I did want to be a writer from very early on, and I was scribbling in notebooks and things. But Mum and Dad said, you should get a real job. And I think that's part of the thing too, isn't it? A lot of people say, well, what do you do? And saying you're a writer, but what do you really do? Because it's like a hobby. It's not kind of, people don't see it as a real job, especially if you're working from home. You're working from home, you can't really be working, right? It's home. We've changed our attitudes a little bit towards that since the pandemic. But before that, if you're working from home, you're not actually working, are you? You're just hanging out at home watching TV and sitting in your pajamas and eating chocolate biscuits. That's really what you're doing, right? So I think there is an attitude towards writing, or perhaps it's that whole image of, writers sitting away in an attic, tap, 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 and then suddenly the book is finished and the publicist comes along, and then suddenly there's champagne, launches, which, it's not the reality of of writing. So yes, Dad said, don't be a writer. There's no money in it. And for a few people that are doing very well, yes, there is. But for most of us, it's a really hard job.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
hard.
So if I can, because I can relate to that, or I've got family members who can probably relate to that as well. Being told, get a real job, just go get a real job. How did you feel about that at that time? Being a 10-year-old or a young person, maybe early teens or whatever, wanting to write, but finding out that actually that's not a pathway for you. How did that shape you, and what did you decide from there?
Yeah, I was a good little girl, and I did what my parents told me. I trusted them, and I think in a lot of ways that they did. My parents did everything to give me the best possible life. They totally did. But maybe I wouldn't be the writer I am today if I hadn't taken that course through science and become a research scientist. And I did some management degree, and and I think they shaped me. They shaped the way I think. I'm a logical thinker, and I know how to do research. I can find the information I need in order to write the thing I want to write. So that really formed me. And also I write speculative, and so it's really great to be able to underpin your work with actual science and be able to read the science and say this this might happen, this is possible. So I think that's been really helpful for informing my writing. Also, science is methodical, and there's a certain type of approach to it, there's a rigor to it. And writing, while it's creative, also has a kind of rigor to it. There are some rules, and you need to know those rules, and then you can break them. But there is a rigor to it. And so I think that I wouldn't be the writer I am today without having taken that course. So I don't regret it. But and I do believe Mum and Dad just simply said, you need to get a proper job, because you need to be able to look after yourself. So I think that that's a reasonable thing for parents to want for their children. They also wanted me to be Kiwi, because being Asian, they understood, was not going to help me in New Zealand as much as in those days. Like I said, I'm nearly 60. So I don't speak any Cantonese. My mother speaks 2 dialects of Cantonese. She speaks Cantonese and Hakka, and I can't speak a word. I actually speak French fluently, but I don't speak any Chinese. And so I've lost a part of myself, and I totally believe my parents thought that was in the best interests of me. If I wanted to get ahead, I needed to speak strong English. I needed to integrate and assimilate with everybody here. And in doing that, I lost a part of myself. So they did everything they could to give me the best life. So I'm not blaming them. But, sometimes in doing that, we inadvertently sort of don't let people discover their own selves. I don't.
There's a consequence to everything, isn't there?
Yeah,
I suppose.
it is.
And like you say, your parents have just got to make the choices with the knowledge that they've got and the understanding that they've got at that time, that they feel is best.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you were a good girl, you said, and you followed that pathway. So when you left, or when you were going through school, what was your kind of thought process? What do I want to do? What am I going to, obviously enjoyed writing, but you...
Yeah, the whole Asian thing is, you need to do science, or you need to do medicine. That's very Asian, actually. And right. I don't think it was Mum that I guess that might have been the whole, move from blue collar to white collar type of thing from the 50s, that came through my dad's family. Dad was obviously a big influence on me. So I got an education. I think I was the first person in my family to get a degree. I had 3. And so that was a big deal. First woman, as well, so that was pretty something. So, and my mum didn't have that opportunity. She had to leave school when she was in 6th form. She was very bright. And so for me to have had that opportunity to get an education, that was huge. So, yeah.
And so how did you choose what you were going to... you select for your degrees, and what were you thinking that you were going to go become?
Yeah, exactly. I thought I was going to do medicine because that's exactly what my parents thought I should do. A little bit, and I kind of just, I just well, I was doing really well in school. I was very lucky. I had great teachers and great support. So actually, I remember back in the fifth form when we had school certificate, I did 6 subjects, and I did 3 art subjects and 3 science subjects, math and science and what have you. And I said, well, whichever one I get the best results for, I'll go either arts or I'll go sciences. And I got exactly the same results on both sides. So, got A's for all across, so... It didn't help me make a decision at all. And Mum and Dad were saying, you should, if you got a job in science or in medicine or in the health sciences, you would have a job, and then you can do this other stuff. So again, they gave me the advice that they thought would work for me. So I met my partner at university. He was doing sciences. He has a PhD in physics and software engineer. So maybe I got something out of that. He's my biggest supporter and sponsor. I mean, I couldn't be a writer without his support because financially it's really, I have yet to make minimum wage as a writer, having written full-time for 15 years. And sometimes, I'm doing 60-hour weeks. And so it's... I could go to the grocery store and earn more probably. So it's a sacrifice and also a privilege to be able to write. So I'm really grateful. So if I hadn't taken that course, would I be writing? Maybe not, And then David's career has taken us all around the world. We've lived in the United States. We lived in England for a while, and we also lived in France for 7 years. So I've had this wonderful opportunity to experience life in different places, which I might not have had. So I'm very, I don't think you can regret your life choices to a certain extent. They are what they are, and it's to make the most of what they are at the, as you go on.
That's right. They're all building blocks, aren't they? Making you who you are today, and what you do today will make you who you are tomorrow. That kind of thing.
Exactly.
And that's really what we're trying to explore here with this podcast is really, what was your journey? So you've talked a little bit about that, but you started to write properly, maybe I'll call it that, a little bit later in life. So your career before that, you worked as a scientist.
I was, when we lived abroad, I was New Zealand Energy Advisor to the OECD. So, but mostly I didn't, because we have a son who has ADHD and Asperger's, so we needed one of us to be home, and we just made that decision. So for a long time I didn't work in the traditional sense of working. I worked at home. I looked after our children while my husband's career, progressed, and we moved around the world. And so, it was wonderful when he sort of said, you should do something for yourself now. The kids are in school and you've got a little bit more time, and, why don't you do it? Why don't you stop talking about it? Why don't you stop talking about writing and just jolly well do it? And that sort of gave me the permission to do it.
So that was the stimulus then? That was what? The moment?
Yeah. So he's been a great supporter. He doesn't read fiction. So I'm very lucky. He's been a great supporter and sponsor of my work, even though he doesn't really like fiction.
Right. Okay. But he likes you, and that's important. So he's supporting you, and if you're happy, then that's the main thing, isn't it?
Steve, I think I'm just thinking about your question about, how have I been formed, and how has my childhood and my upbringing formed me? And one of the things that I think is really true about my upbringing is that Mum and Dad were involved in everything. So they were on the PTA, and they were, Dad was a swimming club coach, and Mum was, we did St. John's, and we did, Girls Brigade, and they were the netball team coach, and they were on the church committees, and, every jolly thing we did, and there were 4 of us, and we were music lessons and, school plays and camps and whatever it was, my parents were doing it. They were in there in every committee. Dad used to say, you'd go to these committees and it'd be the same people, like the swim club and the rugby club, and, they'd always be the same people, the community-minded people to say, well, I want something, we're doing this thing and we're enjoying it and we want to be part of this community, so we will serve the community, we will help. And that is something that I have carried, and I know my siblings are the same, have carried through our lives. If you want something and you are interested in something, then you get involved and you do the thing. So you build the community around it. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I've learned coming through my childhood from my parents, is that community, that sense of community. I think when you think about writers, you think we're just sitting at our desk and we're just plugging along, putting our stuff on the page. But actually, writing is about community, and, you need people to read your work and help you, help you hone it and polish it. It's not an entirely solitary process. And then
It's
you've got
counterintuitive. Well, it's not counterintuitive. It's counter what people would think. I think you're right. You've said that. You would think that that's what it is, locking yourself away in order to be able to think and create, and you don't come out until you've got some work done. It feels like when you're not a writer that's would be the process. So it's interesting that it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, especially when you're learning, it isn't. I have probably 6 or 7 mentees at any one time. And of course, that mentees are forever. So, even mentees I had 10 years ago are still contacting me about things. I have mentors of my own, who I still sometimes contact, what should I do? What's my, around my career and progression, and you need people around you. You need other editors. You need contributors if you're putting together an anthology. You need to talk about trends and topics and tropes and the things that you're writing about. So being part of those communities is extremely, extremely important. And I just, there's a little bit of what's in it for me attitude that people take when they join things. Why should I pay the membership? Because, what's in it for me? And I don't see it that way. And I think that's mum and dad's really their ethic that's coming through, because their attitude was, well, you can pay your membership, and if you don't do anything, that membership money is so the people who are doing things and putting together activities or creating the services that are part of that community can do the thing. But you also can jump in and do the thing so that the community thrives. And it's critical mass, isn't it? You're part of a critical mass. So I think it's not about kind of what's in it for me, but I have to say that by doing that, I have generated so much joy and been able to network with these amazing communities who've supported me, lifted me. So, I'm working a lot in Asian women's horror, and raising the voices of new writers, and they're doing the same for me. Hey, have you read Lee Murray? She's a voice in Asian women's horror and New Zealand horror, and I'm grateful for that. I go to conferences and I meet people, readers, and it's word of mouth, isn't it? How many times we say, have you read this book? This is fantastic. I think you'll like this. And then meeting publishers. Oh, you're writing things that I'm interested in. And sometimes when they just meet you because you're busy, being the volunteer. Oh, I remember meeting her. Maybe I'll read what she's written. And that's how things grow.
Yeah.
So community is insanely important, especially when you're a writer. And to a certain extent, there is a little bit of bums on seats, but there's also this element of, well, once you've done the work, it needs to be polished. You need to get lots of input, sensitivity readers and that kind of thing, editors. And then, you've got to get it out there. Who's interested? So who else is, what are the other writers writing this kind of work? Is there similarity in your readership? That kind of thing, to sort of get the work out there. Where will I best present it? So you're never on your own. And I think if you are on your own, I think it'd be a lonely place. You need to connect, because it can be very lonely. You could make it lonely.
Yeah. So I'm reminded of a couple of things there. One was I interviewed my old professor, David McKee from the University of Waikato a few weeks ago, and he said, I asked him what was sort of his approach to life, if you like, was to give more than you receive. And then he told that to someone, and they turned around and said, "Yep, and I bet you've never succeeded, have you?" And he says, "No, they're right, because the more you put out there, you're not doing it to receive, but the more you get, you seem to get back."
Totally do.
And that's kind of what you're describing there, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not, you don't do service to in order to get. It's not that what's in it for me attitude, but those things come back in spades. I mean, I'm walking proof of that. I don't think if I hadn't engaged with the horror community, international horror community, I would be where I am today, because they've supported me, and yeah, exactly that. It's exactly that.
And so, are you saying, Lee, then, that you were kind of taught that, if you like, or learned that from your parents?
Yeah, totally modelled by my parents. They were everywhere.
Yeah.
They were on everything. Whether they were the treasurer of this and, the secretary of that. They were everything. And there were 4 of us, and we all did multiple activities, and they were everywhere. And they modelled that in their own lives, professional organisations, and they were both involved in professional organisations and book groups, and their own interests as well, and rowing clubs and sailing clubs, and those running clubs. They were just in everything, and I think that community is everything. Community is everything, and kindness is everything. At the end of the day, and those things make me happy. And now when I think back over my life, and what are the things that I've achieved that I'm really, really proud of. And one of the things is, I have some service awards from the New Zealand Speculative Fiction Writers Group, from Tauranga Writers, which is New Zealand's longest standing writing group, supporting writers. And I'm a life member there, and a life member of Spec Fic NZ. And I've been, in the last couple of years, I was given the International Horror Writers Mentor of the Year Award. And to me, I know if Dad's looking down on me, he'll be going, that's the thing he's most proud of. I'm going to cry. I know that of all the things I've done, that's the thing he'll be most proud of, that I've reached out and helped other people and given them a chance to get a step up the ladder, and that makes me just really proud. And when I think of the names that I'm standing there against, not against, but with, people like Linda D. Addison, who's, a Black horror poet, and poetry is not a big genre, and she is the first Black woman to receive this award. She's a Lifetime Achievement Award winner. So being in the ranks of someone like Linda Addison, just incredible. Tim Wagner, just some names that just incredible people who have given so much to horror and to the community, and that makes me so proud. So yeah, that's probably one of those service awards for for being part of the community. It's like, I liked your stuff and I said this is great, and they gave me an award for it. It's like, it's like, wow. But those are the things I'm very, very proud of.
Yeah, like you say, it sounds like that would be the thing that's core to your family, and so your father.
Yeah,
would be
it is
proud.
Definitely core to our family. Yeah, for sure.
So, can I ask? I think there's something here I want to explore around the comment you said about your husband, your partner, David. Is that right, David? David said, just go write. Stop talking about it and go write. So you were obviously talking about it. I'd like to explore that a little bit, because I'm sure that there are lots of people, and in fact most of us at some point in time or other have wanted to do something, but maybe there are things that have fear maybe has got in the way of us doing it. And I'm just interested to explore how long you were talking about doing it for, why you were talking about it, what was driving you towards wanting to do that, but also what was preventing you from that.
Yeah, that's probably a really good question, and I think it's probably me, that whole self-doubt, imposter syndrome. A lot of writers suffer from it. So, yeah, I don't know. What is this my story to tell? What have I got to say that's important that anyone would want to listen to? I guess, yeah. I don't know. I got sort of tied up in that idea of write what you know. You often hear that as a writer. You should write what you know, but actually, I think you should write what you're passionate about. And so I ended up writing about New Zealand, because I love this country and I love the landscape and the people, and so that was kind of where I sort of started. I kind of wrote about the things that I loved. I sort of moved away from so much what I know, because I can find out. You can find out as a researcher. You can find out, but I just was. So I moved into writing what I'm passionate about, and a lot of that is exploring those intersections between myth and culture, and the things that really concern us, the things that really are part of our everyday that make us that grip us, the stories that we're reading in the newspaper, the things that really matter to us, but why did I not start before? Maybe I was just holding on to those ideas of I shouldn't be doing this, and I should be getting a real job, and I should, maybe. And I'm just grateful to him for giving me the permission, and say maybe I thought, I should be contributing financially. And I still feel that sometimes, that I should be contributing more financially than I am to our family, family's sort of well-being, and so I think, and also, can I do it? Because can I do it? So, because writing is all about rejection. You're rejected by publishers and literary agents and editors, and, there'll be 800 submissions for 20 spaces on an anthology, by magazine editors. You're just rejected everywhere. Your readers send a review. They hated your work. They loved it. They hated it. It's just, you're just rejected everywhere. And in New Zealand, there's no publishers for horror. Nobody publishes horror. None. So you've got to go somewhere else. And of course I write horror, it's like, I tell this story because horror is one of those things we love to pretend we don't like. So, it's like romance books, the bodice rippers, and horror books, and dad joke books, joke books. You hide them under the bed, right? But if you're reading War and Peace, or you're reading, 80,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or you're reading Eleanor Catton's, The Luminaries, well, that's literary fiction, so that's okay. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's okay. But, oh, no, well, you hide. I think Kindle's made a difference, right? Because you can't see what people are reading. They can't see the cover. But actually, horror is actually sort of a dirty secret, isn't it, amongst readers? We don't... Right. So literary fiction, a lot of the time, I think, is what we pretend to read, and horror fiction is what we pretend not to read.
Right. Okay.
So writers are rejected. Horror writers are really rejected, and being an Asian horror writer, or a Kiwi horror writer, we're sort of stuck off on the end of the world where there's no publishers, so we've got to take our work overseas. And there's this kind of literary sort of genre divide. You know, people say, well, I'm not going to read. It's genre. It's got to be rubbish. You know?
Right.
So actually, it's tricky. And personally, I have nothing against literary fiction. You know, I read a lot of literary fiction. But, you know, I think part of the problem there is that we're all fighting over the same money. And there isn't much money, you know, in terms of the bucket of funding, for example, for creative work, there's almost nothing. And genre fiction almost never gets a look in. Romance fiction never gets a look in. They do their own thing. And so, you know, it sort of pits people against each other, which is silly because we're all the same community. You know, we're all writers looking to tell stories that resonate for people, that help people make sense of the world and find meaning in their lives, or just entertain them and just let them escape for a wee moment from the things that worry them. And so writing is all about rejection. So I don't know, maybe why did I not start? I just think I felt like an imposter. Like, who was I to have, you know, what did I have to say, and could I even do this? So maybe that was the reason.
I think you said it earlier, that question stuck with me. Can I do it? And it's a really deep, powerful question, isn't it? It's the thing that probably stops most people from doing lots of things. Can I do it? Because until you actually give it a go, you never know, do you? And
it doesn't really matter. I mean, when I'm working with students, and I do quite a lot of work with students. In fact, I was the co-convener of Young New Zealand Writers, and for a decade we did sort of courses with students and free, you know, we did free to enter anthologies so students could get a chance to be published. And I often tell them, it's no longer, we've just closed it because we're exhausted, but I often tell students that there's no one other than them. You know, their story is unique in the moment. So there is no one there's living their exact life with their exact background and makeup and perspective. And there's no one that can tell their story in the way that they can tell it. No one. Everyone has their unique view of things, of the world. And so even if it's never published, they should write some things down and keep them for themselves, you know, to get it on the page. And maybe your children will read it, or maybe you'll take it out in 10 years' time and read it and find something there of your former self. And I think so give it a go. You know, don't feel like you have to be an imposter, because you can. And you might share it with someone and they might feel, you know, seen. And they might identify with that piece of writing, and it might work for them and resonate for them. So, you know, just because, I mean, publishing's a whole different ballgame, but there's no reason why you can't write down what you feel and how you see things, and for you, you know, for you, because there's a lot to be said for just being creative. And I think about the pandemic, and, you know, we were all stuck in our little bubbles. And what were we doing? You know, we were doing creative things to kind of find solace and to find meaning. And I think apparently zombie books took off, you know, apocalyptic books just took off in the pandemic. But you know what we were doing? We were learning to bake, and we were reading books and watching movies and drawing, and
we call it mindfulness these days, don't we? And actually it was just
creativity.
being creative. Yeah.
So the answer to the question of, you know, I don't know why I felt I needed permission, but my husband gave me permission, and I haven't looked back, and I haven't asked him if it's time to stop yet either.
Was there an essence there of, and I'm just thinking out loud really here, but was there an essence there of, if your husband's saying to you, there's no reason from my perspective for you not to do this, was that kind of removing a reason, or maybe I've used the word excuse, I don't necessarily mean that, but, you know, in your mind, the fear of going ahead, if those start to sort of fall away, then you've kind of got to go forward, or stop talking about it, stop dreaming about it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things that I did was I said, I'm a writer. I said I'm a writer. Like people don't say that. Well, I remember saying to someone I was a writer, and they said, yeah, but not really. It's just what you say because you're at home, right? And I go, no, I'm a writer. And I think that's owning it. I took the step to own it. I am a writer. One of the things, too, I think about women particularly is that we don't believe we can do it unless we've got the qualification. um, you know, and I don't know what that is, but women tend to, I think this is true, that women tend to sort of be overqualified. So I rushed out to do some courses. So I started off doing some novel writing courses with North Tech, Polytech. So because I didn't think I knew anything, and I read a million books about how to write a novel, and to be honest, even now I still don't know how to write a novel. And I've written, 12 or 15. And because every time I sit down, I have this imposter syndrome, like, oh my God, how do I write a novel? Because it is a creative endeavor. So there are some general principles for writing a novel, but to be honest, it all happens in your head. Well, at least for me. I know people use novel writing software and they order their chapters and they use the hero's journey and the 4-act structure and all of that kind of thing. But in my head, I write the beginning. Often I write the end, I know kind of where it's going, I might have some major plot points, but basically it's magic. It kind of happens when I sit down and it's magic. I still think it's magic. I still don't know how I do it, and occasionally my beta readers will come and say, oh, I think there's a gap here. And oh yeah, so and then I realize I foreshadowed it over here at the beginning of the book anyway. And it's just kind of magic how it comes together. I do not know how I do it. I don't know. It's like the artificial intelligence box, the machine learning box where stuff goes in and it comes out and the scientists don't know how it happens. And yes, there are some general principles that we know that this is how you put together a novel. But yeah, it's magic. So every time I sit down, I feel like an imposter.
So it's not gone away then?
No, it's not going away.
Despite winning so many awards.
No, actually, I was in a conference last year and I was actually invited to a panel on imposter syndrome because clearly people have read that. I mean, I still can't believe it. And the thing about the awards, and I have 4 International Bram Stoker Awards now. I'm nowhere near Stephen King, who has 12, but I have 4, and that's pretty good. And for New Zealand, it's never been heard of. And every time I get an award, I have quite a few now. I think there's a mistake and someone's going to find me out. So it makes me kind of want to work harder, that I feel like someone's going to read this and realize that I really didn't deserve it. And so I just have to keep working harder to do better, to write better, to be better. So that imposter syndrome serves me in some ways.
I was just going to say that, yeah. So if it's serving you, it's not necessarily a problem per se in that it's your kind of mechanism for continuous improvement, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think if you think you've made it, if you think you're the biz, then there's no point in writing because you're not doing anything innovative. I think if I thought that I had, I was the top of the game, then why would I? Yeah, I think I'd come crashing down very quickly because I've read some other, I read other people's work and I think, wow, I wish I'd written that, So I still think my best work is the work that I haven't yet written.
Yeah. So is there an element of that imposter syndrome thing? Is that self-doubt, not just about the process, but is there an element of self-doubt about you, Lee? Is that, so that you've written 12, 15 novels, but you're still feeling that way? Is it, is it deeper than just about book writing? Is there a self-doubt there in general terms, or?
It's probably exacerbated by the fact that I have anxiety and have a depression. So those, I'm a person who cogitates, and that is anxiety, isn't it? It's kind of, it's a lot like editing, actually, when you question everything, you revise it. Shall I have, is this the right way to say things? And, when you have anxiety, that's exactly what you do. You think, oh, I should have said this, I should have said that. They're going to think this, they're going to think that. And so I think that's probably part of it. And I wasn't diagnosed with depression and anxiety until I was 50. So I've spent 50 years of my life wondering what the hell was wrong with me. And I think part of that is, my dad had a little sister who was autistic. And so, that there was a lot of stigma around mental illness and in those days. And Asian cultures they kind of deny it. Right. And so, and I don't think my parents ever thought that I had anxiety and depression, but I did have, it was like, you just, get on and don't have any self-pity, and, you just need to, you're very privileged, and I am very privileged and very lucky. So why am I depressed? But those I think do exacerbate those feelings of imposter syndrome. And then on the other hand, I'm being more open about that, and it's a little bit like my Asian culture. I'm sort of thinking, well, this is part of me too, and exploring that. And I think it's interesting there. And I'm actually currently the co-chair of the Horror Writers Association's mental health initiative, the Wellness Committee, because we're looking at destigmatizing mental illness in horror. Horror has been, particularly film, but horror has been an area where there's a lot of use of mental illness as a way of as demonizing people. And even our language, the way we use language, we still say commit suicide instead of, died by suicide, or we say someone's psycho or crazy. So the kinds of language that we use and the way we demonize characters. So we're looking at using, and moving towards more positive representations of mental illness in horror. So just because you have a mental illness doesn't make you the monster or a villain or necessarily violent or any of those things. It just means that you have an illness. We treat things so differently. If you have all sorts of ways, for example, if you have if you have a headache, people say, well, take an aspirin, because, you'll feel better. But when we talk about mental illness, oh, don't take medication, that's terrible. So we have there is a lot of stigma. So in the Horror Writers Association, we're trying to address that stigma, not through therapy, of course, but through writing more positive representations of mental illness in our horror writing. And also because writing and creativity, as we've just said, is such a great way to actually express yourself and actually sort of it's a great way to actually recover, because it's getting stuff down on paper. It's the way of analyzing, looking at it from a point of safety, and it's very cathartic to be able to write those demons onto the page and sort of separate yourself from them. So I think the imposter syndrome has a lot to do with that. I'm not saying that everyone who has imposter syndrome suffers from depression or anxiety, but I know that hasn't helped. And again, when you get a rejection, how do you deal with that rejection? That can just really throw you for a loop if you've and writing is a lot about rejection.
Yeah, you said that before, and that was the connection I was making in my mind, is that if you're suffering from anxiety and you're heading into, or you're not heading into, you're deep in a writing career where it's all about rejection, how does that play out? How do you manage that?
That is really tricky, and isolation is an issue, isn't it? Because we know when we have anxiety and depression that if you're isolated, it's worse. If you pull yourself back from the community, it's worse. All of those kinds of things, and you become it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? I'm useless, so therefore I will pull back, and so nobody sees what you're doing. You don't have any community around you. So it's almost sort of contradictory, isn't it? So almost I have to make sure I go out and get that community, that social connection. And, to a certain extent, this whole Zoom mentality, the non-in-person thing has been kind of helpful. Because you can still be in your safe little living room and also be in a community by Zooming in on panels, and you can't see the thousands of people, or well, not thousands, but you can't see the other 60 people in the room. Or it's a bit like you and I here talking here, Steve. There's just you and I, right? But maybe some other people might watch this and I can pretend that it's just you and I. So there's that.
Yeah.
So there is a way of having community with some safety, so this whole virtual world of community has been helpful for me a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah, I when I'm at conferences, if I feel overwhelmed, I go back to my room, I scroll through the internet for pictures of puppies.
Okay.
I will go for a walk, I do the things that I need to do to feel more connected, more grounded is the word. And then I try not to isolate myself too much, because I think that community is how I've succeeded, because, well, as I said before, community is just so vital for me as a writer. And but also it's part of the problem, isn't it? When you're anxious, when you have social anxiety, it's like, so I always break out in hives when I go to a conference.
Right.
It's just, I just have to live through it. I just have to get through it. So it is a bit of...
But I suppose knowing as well, awareness is half the battle in anything, isn't it? I think that's just my opinion on things as well. I was going to ask you about, so you said that you went through your first 50 years of life, not knowing the diagnosis, what it was, but something felt different, or something felt. How did it feel? How did you know that there was something there?
I think it was just I'm one of those kids that just was, overthought things, and
Right.
And also I've got a mole on my shoulder. It's kind of it's an Asian. It's a Chinese thing, you carry the burdens of the world on your shoulder, snake. I'm born in the year of the snake, so, we're overthinkers.
Okay.
So there's all these kind of cultural aspects that sort of play into it as well. And of course, my dad, coming from a family where his own sister, had a mental illness, and, at the time there was, shock treatments were being discussed and that kind of thing. So so he had his own concerns around that, because he lost his sister. She was only 12. And so he still was traumatized about that, obviously. So, there is that. So I don't think they ignored it. They just didn't see it in the same way. And I didn't have a name for it. I just thought it was me.
Just you, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it kind of is.
It is. Yeah. And I did a lot of running for many years, and I think that actually helped. So for a long time, I sort of held it at bay by running, because I would run every day or every other day. So, when you're physically active, that helps with anxiety and depression. It's meditation on the hoof. I'd just be thinking, it's time out. It's meditation through movement. And also I had a big social network through running. I would run with friends and people and talk and chat. And I'm a very slow runner, just like I'm a slow writer. So, it was great. You're in the back of the pack and you're just enjoying the day. And so 4 hours of chatting, that's social time as well. So that was possibly quite therapeutic. And then when I injured myself and wasn't able to run, I really fell. I really got very isolated, and that was when I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And so I've learned a bit from that. I mean, obviously therapy is individual, and you have to see your own doctor and get your own advice. But for me, I know that writing helps me, and going out for walks helps me, and scrolling puppies on the internet helps me. You know?
Did the diagnosis itself help you, like to understand yourself, and then once you understood a bit more, able to work out what you needed to do to manage it?
Yeah, I came up against a bit of stigma. You know, when you start saying you have it, and I know people will say, "Oh, she's that woman with anxiety and depression," not "she's that writer," or so I just so I am open about it because I think shared awareness is helpful. When you say, "Oh, I suffer from anxiety and depression," in horror writing circles, you're amazed about how many people come out of the woodwork and say, "Yes, and I use writing to help me process this some of the stuff as well." So,
Because
yeah.
you've written something on that, I've read, or it was you had some conversations with a lot of writers about.
Yeah, I was part of the Headlands project.
That's the one. Sorry, yes, I've
Yeah,
forgotten the name of it.
and I was the first to bring a panel on, horror and mental illness and horror into the horror writing community, international horror writing community, and I think that's become a standard now because it's a big discussion. There are a lot of elements to look at, addiction, horror, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's. I'm proud of that work. I think we've got a long way to go in horror because it is an area where people have been stigmatized, and some of the portrayals of villains are often, psychopathic, demons, and serial killers, and there are a lot of writers lean into some of those things. So we need to be careful about how we address those. And yeah.
There's so many questions I want to ask, but I want to ask one about horror. Why horror? What when you decided you were 10 years old, you wanted to write, and that's throughout your life you've been creative and writing. What maybe can you? I don't know whether you know, but how did you end up in the horror space?
Yeah, isn't that funny? I have told the story before. So I really fell into that whole "you should write what you know" thing at the beginning of my career. So I was running marathons, and I'd run 25 marathons, and I'd train people to run marathons at the time. And I thought, you know what, I'll write about marathons because I know something about that. And so I wrote this really breezy chick lit novel. Please don't look it up. No, it was my first thing that I wrote, really. And I'm proud of it in the sense that I learned so much from that. I learned a lot of what not to do. I mean, everyone should self-publish and do a first novel like that because it's so important to have those, make all the mistakes. I made every mistake. But that said, I learned how to write. It was my practice novel, if you like, and but at the end of that time, I didn't really understand that chick lit was, as a genre, was kind of dead in the water, and because I was just writing what I knew, and I did write about in New Zealand and set in the bay and running up the mount and things that I'd done. So that was fun. But I realized that I wanted to write things that would kind of resonate for me, that were more important than just the story. The barriers in that particular story were things like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat cupcakes, and I have to go to the gym first thing in the morning, and oh, how am I going to get up this hill, and oh, my lycra tights are running up my bottom, and things like that, and they were fun, but they were not what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about things that mattered to people, that mattered to me, that things that frightened me, things like climate change and feminist issues, and how are we going to protect our native forests, and all of these, just these sorts of things that really concern us. What about people? And I'm working on. I want to write something about Cyclone Gabrielle now, because wow, the impacts to people's lives, things that frighten us, and things that frighten us is horror. And I know a lot of people think horror is haunted houses and serial killers, and there's not a lot of that in my writing. what frightens us is different depending on who you are and where you live and what your background is. So for me, horror is some of the cultural pressures that I feel, the way I'm sort of shoehorned into certain places and also squeezed into certain places. Um, Horror for me is well, I'm totally petrified of heights, so that's horror for me. Horror for me is small spaces, is earthquakes, is those kinds of things. What might happen to my children? And I think those things resonate for lots of people. Right now, I know there's lots of concern about in the United States about pulling back on reproductive rights for women, and so I've been writing some things around that. So the things that really frighten people, and I think that's what people want to read, so they can process it and think about it and analyze it in a way that has a little bit of safety. You stepped back a little bit from it. So yeah, that's how I moved into horror. I think it's a grown-up genre. I think everyone eventually gets there. I think, I truly do. I think that literary horror has those elements where you are looking inside yourself at major life traumas, and so there is an element of horror in that. Horror is a genre that transcends all other genres. You can have a historical novel with horror in it. You can have a romance with horror in it. You can have sci-fi with horror in it. So it's like romance and it's all those things that you hide under the bed: romance and horror and humor. All of those things transcend all those other genres. Doesn't matter what it is. You can have those elements in there. So my work doesn't look necessarily traditional. And I think that's fine, because I'm unique in the sense I live here in this beautiful country with these amazing spaces to include in my horror. And why wouldn't I? Geysers and, forests and just, lonely pasture and beautiful beaches. Why wouldn't I use New Zealand in my fiction? We've got haunted spaces and just, of course we've got insular ideas as well as great progressive ideas. So I want to use New Zealand, and horror is the place. I've just got this opportunity to explore all of these our unique perspective here down under, with also my Asian culture thrown in, and the fact that I'm, have issues with anxiety and depression, and lots of other people feel those things. So I feel like I feel less that imposter syndrome of, is it my story and what have I got to say? Because clearly I have got things to say that must also impact other people. Because if I'm frightened by them, other people must also be frightened by them. Unless I'm totally weird, it's possible.
With things that are going on in the world, you mentioned about going to conferences. I can't remember whether that was before the interview started or during, but you talked about going to conferences and being in that community and seeing what's happening in the space at the minute, where the direction of things and where people are thinking. With what's going on in the world, there's all sorts of things going on in the world at the minute. Being a writer, do you have to be mindful of all of that stuff from a who might I, and I'm asking this question probably because my opinion at the minute is that I feel like I can offend people without actually even opening my mouth at the minute. We're quite a sensitive kind of world, and there's all sorts of things going on. And is there a need to be mindful of what's happening in the world so we don't offend with our writing?
Yeah, it is an issue, isn't it? And look, that is what sensitivity readers are for, and research and beta readers are for. I think it is a tricky area because people, we're talking about own stories and things like that. And it is a tricky area. Thankfully, New Zealand has the Bill of Rights, which allows artists and creatives to express themselves in ways, as they like, providing it's not hate speech or anything like that. But I do think we have a responsibility to look very carefully at our work and make sure that we've researched it and had a number of readers read it and make sure that things are not, I don't mean sanitizing, but I mean being authentic and careful about how we put work out there. And again, this is the same issue with mental illness, that some people with mental illness may be violent, but it is not a given, and so that's been, and that's the stigma that has come with in the past with horror and mental illness. So yes, we do need to be careful about how we address our, what we address in our writing and how we approach it. But I think that research, very thorough research, getting plenty of readers on, eyes on it, and getting feedback and understanding, I think there's some people if you write a serial killer and you're not a serial killer, are you serial killers could be offended. No, I don't mean that flippantly. I mean, it is flippant because, they're fictional characters. So, but we do draw on things. So yes, I think it's a very tricky area. And I think a lot of writers feel hamstrung by that. It is a tricky one. I mean, I write some male characters and I'm not male. So should I do that? You know what I'm saying? So I get plenty of male readers to make sure that the voices are authentic and the characters behave in the way that they ought to. And of course, I will put attitudes into those characters' voices that character might have, might not be mine, and it might not be likable, but it might be appropriate to that character. One of the ways you can get around it. Well, not get around it, but one of the things I do, particularly in my Into the Mist series, Tane McKenna Adventures, is I use a mosaic approach. So that's when you don't write the story from one person's point of view. So I might have 4 or 5 key characters who tell the story, and the main character will be the main person on the page. But I might have this other character giving their point of view on what's happening. And so you get these different perspectives because that is how the world is, isn't it? We all see things differently. So in a story, that's also a great way to do it, is to say, well, there's this person with this attitude and there's this person with this attitude, and the reader can make their own mind up. So that's a cunning trick that novelists use.
Is the researcher, I mean, you're a scientist, you've got background in science.
Research, yeah.
Is the research aspect of writing a big part for you that you enjoy?
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. It's really dangerous, actually, because that's probably why I don't write very much. Because I get down these
too busy researching
research rabbit holes, and I know people who say just leave a space and come back to it. I'm like, no, it never works for me, because I want those things to feature in my writing and be, I want the reader to be satisfied and have a really engaging read. So yeah, I do tend to go down little rabbit holes. I often contact people, could you tell me about this? Call people up and say, if you're writing Dan Rabitz and I wrote a series based on we wrote a sort of crime noir, supernatural crime noir series set in Auckland. But we interestingly, in the 3rd book, we wrote a massacre, on a sort of gang massacre on the wharf of Auckland. And at the time, we had to stop writing. We were in the middle of writing when the shootings happened in Christchurch, and we just kind of felt we'd done something a little bit prophetic. It was we were just so, we were blithely writing this narrative, it's fictional. It was fictional, it was fun, and then suddenly this event happened in New Zealand that we were sort of thinking, that doesn't happen here. So for us, it was horror. We were writing it on the page. And then this happened. It was real life horror for real people. It was just devastating. We had to take a hiatus from the novel because we just did not know how to do it justice. And then when we came back to it, we actually got some advice from, forensic police officer, and also, from Maori advisors, because what did that look like in New Zealand? What are the rules around, human remains and grieving families and that kind of thing. So we hadn't seen that really in New Zealand. So what happens, when there are mass casualties of, from a certain culture, and what about those cultural beliefs? And so there was a lot of work to be done, just first of all processing those things, and also what happens in New Zealand. And New Zealand was still learning that, right? We didn't know probably there were some procedures in place, but we hadn't seen it happen. We hadn't seen it played out in real life, and then it did, so sort of we're a bit lucky. I'm not saying that sounds very flippant, and I don't mean that. But we had this opportunity to tap into some research and some experts to sort of get a feel for what might actually happen in that case, so that our writing was authentic,
based on reality.
Yeah, but enough to be plausible. You don't have to put all the rules in. The thing is with writing is that you're actually liable. Okay, so in your contract as a writer, the publisher will say, anything, any methods or whatever, anything, you're liable. We're not liable. The publisher's not liable. It's the author that's liable. So here's a story. So in Battle of the Birds, which is a little novel for children, I have a scene where the children make a hot air balloon out of bark, out of tree bark, pounded tree bark. Now, whether that's plausible or not, and they fly it to White Island. This was well before we had our disaster at White Island, and they used, and when they came back, they used the hot gases and what have you from White Island to come back. The story is set 1,000 years ago, so and the kids love it. But the reality is, if some children made a balloon and out of using my instructions and tried to get to White Island and drowned, I am liable. If it can be shown that they used the instructions out of my novel to try and get to what. So you do have to be careful about what you actually put in. So okay, so a Molotov cocktail. There's plenty of instructions about how to make a Molotov cocktail on the internet. So I'm pretty safe there if I put a Molotov cocktail in one of my stories. But there is. Yeah, you're right that, research is really important, but also just enough to be plausible and not enough to give everyone a step-by-step instruction about how to poison your grandmother or something like that.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now, it makes you wonder how mhave books have ever been written really under those circumstances, how you dare write a book or make a movie, just in case you're kind of giving people instructions and you're liable. But so does that kind of thing, does that stymie the creative process?
No, you just have to be a little bit careful, and you get good editors who ask the questions, and it doesn't stymie. In fact, it's interesting because you want your story to be authentic, so you want to include as much of that. I mean, people are thrown out of stories if the writer hasn't done their work, and you think, oh, that's not how it happens, or you've got the wrong, in New Zealand we ring 111, in the US it's a different number, So people are thrown out of a story if you get those little details wrong. Military fiction, if you get the gun make wrong or something, then you're in big trouble. Those people are very particular about, those kinds of details. So details do make a difference to the sort of the richness of your narrative. So it's important, and it's also not. It's just enough to be plausible, and to make your reader suspend disbelief and be carried along with the tale.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors. I'm really pleased to announce that we have Sharp New Zealand as a sponsor, and it's great to have Sharp on board because as a customer, I can speak about their products and services from personal experience. And it feels good to be able to endorse and recommend a company because of the level of satisfaction we have regarding the services they provide. And across my businesses, we've certainly been impressed with the care and collaboration we've experienced in our dealings with Sharp. It's certainly a brand that we trust. Sharp has a long history of creating breakthrough products designed to meet the needs of people living in New Zealand. Sharp's leadership in technology innovation ensures it's at the forefront of the pack, providing business solutions from printing and photocopying to interactive meeting solutions and ICT phone systems. No matter where you are or what size your organisation, whether you're large or small, Sharp New Zealand can provide their services to you nationwide. If you're looking to upgrade your technology or renew your photocopier leases, talk to your local Sharp team or visit the website at sharp.net.nz. Can I ask you then, Lee, and you've talked about people's perspectives or perceptions that writing's not a job; it's just you're just at home. You mentioned that earlier, and clearly, obviously, if you're not a writer, ignorance makes you sort of form those opinions. What does that creative process, writing process, look like? Because when we talk about research, it seems like a significant portion of it that you would spend a lot of time researching. You've got to have some creative ideas. You've got to develop a story, right? Can you talk us through what that process looks like, how you come up with an idea, and then the length of time it takes to turn it into something that you can put forward? Because I think that would give people an idea of actually how much work is involved in this,
Yeah, it's tricky. So for a novel, you usually would write, you just come up with your own idea and write the novel and then pitch it, unless it's been contracted. For a short story, and I get a lot of requests for short story. I think I've written maybe 80 short stories, and some of them, when I say short stories, some of them will be up to 10,000 words kind of thing. Usually an editor will come to me. So in the past, I used to submit, but now I have a bit of a name as a writer, so they'll come to me and they'll say, we'd like to invite you to be part of this work. Will you submit a story? And they'll give me the general word count and the theme or the topic that they want to address. So this anthology might be about, I don't know, pumpkins at Halloween or something. And you are asked to write a story on a particular topic. So I've just done one on sort of the bleak midwinter, Halloween type story, for example. And you have to come up with something that the other 100 writers that are submitting or whatever don't come up with. So first of all, they give you the theme. So that's a start point already, So when you say, sometimes when you're out, say, well, why don't you write a story? And it's just too big. Like any story is just too big to pull something out of the air. And I keep some notes of, I think I'd like to write a story about that. Or, so I do keep notes about things that I think would be great story ideas. In fact, I'm really cross because I thought once about, a chain letter for murders, and then Adrian McKinty went and wrote it before me. Damn it. Yeah, so basically I often now get, for short stories at least, I get an idea straight away from the editor or the publisher. We want to write a book about this. Can you write a story about this? Yes, right, and it needs to be horror. And I often say to them, would you like a Kiwi story? Would you like a New Zealand themed story? Yes, we would love that. They always say yes when I say that. Something about New Zealand fiction and New Zealand setting they love. And then I just go away and I have to think something up. And that's really hard because like I say, they might have a submission call for 5 or 6 places on the anthology or the magazine, and they may get several hundred, sometimes several thousand entries. So I have to write something that isn't in that several thousand entries. It has to stand out. If they've invited me, they generally will accept the story, providing it's good, but they don't have to. So, you don't get the contract until you've written the story. And then so that may involve walks and research and just thinking and just what about if, then I just think about, can I put two stories together, two ideas together to make a story? I have a colleague here in Tauranga who's a writer and a teacher, and I often go for walks with her, and we just say, what if, and come up with ideas. Brilliant. She's way better at ideas than me. I steal all her good ideas. And so often creative process involves bandying around, brainstorming things. Sometimes I stand in the shower and think about it. Showers are really good for that. I don't know what it is about steam, but a lot of writers say they stand in the shower and think about it. Sometimes it'll take me a week or two before I get down to writing it around my other work commitments. And usually it will take me 2 weeks to write a short story. And let me just tell you that the standard rate for a short story is about, it should be, it's usually, a good rate is 10 cents a word. And, but it can be anything from 1 cent a word up to 10 cents a word. That's for genre fiction. It's really bad. So back in the day, I think in Little Women, I think the character Jo sells the story for $100 or something. It's not any better now.
Wow.
But it's probably 2 or 3 weeks' work for me to write a short story. So this is where the not making minimum wage comes in. And I just want to say something about USA Today and New York Times best-selling writers, okay? So, which is fantastic. And I am a USA Today best-selling author, but that is for 1 week on the USA Today charts. That is 1 week of sales and not forever sales. So for once, if you're a 5-time New York Times best-selling author, 5 times you've got on that 1 week list. It doesn't represent necessarily of sales across the rest of the year. It might be release day sales or something like that. So I think this is kind of, well, yes, best-selling is great. Don't, I'm not knocking that at all. But I think people don't quite understand that actually writing, even very successful writers may be really struggling to make ends meet financially, because we get maybe $1 for every book sold, if that. And if it's sold secondhand, we don't get anything, and if it's, and if it's returned to the bookstore returns it to the distributor, we don't get anything. If it's reduced on sale price, we don't get anything. If it's sold in a library and shared around, we don't get anything. New Zealand has a public lending right. So if your book if you've got 50 copies of a particular book in a library, then you can get a cut of that public lending right, which I think is still just $2 million a year, which is shared around all the writers that have books in libraries. But genre writers, well, all my publishers are overseas, so you probably won't find my books in the library. So I don't get a cut of that either. So, right. It's hard. And getting books to New Zealand, it's that age-old story, $5 for the book and $100 for shipping.
Yeah.
So it's very, very tricky. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. So with that in mind, why would anyone want to become an author, I suppose, is the question. What do you get from it?
It's just the best job.
I was just going to say, what do you get?
Job.
You've given me an indication over our conversation about that, and your energy and passion for it is not diminished in the time that we've been talking. So clearly, there's more to it than just money.
Oh no, God, you don't. I don't do it for the money.
Yeah. So what is it? What inspires you, and what if anyone else is listening, who's thinking about writing or wanting to get started, why should they do it?
Look, I'm a bit of a homebody, so I quite like being at home. I like writing at home. I like writing in my caravan. I like that I can come to work in my pajamas and my little dog sits at my feet, or she actually sits behind my back and in the little small of my back between the back of the chair and me, and she just wiggles in there. She likes that. I share an office with my husband. I like being in his company. And I just love being immersed in ideas and stories and narratives. I love what it does for me when you get that eureka moment and the magic comes together and the story works. And you think, oh, thank goodness. I love it when children write to me and say, oh, Mrs. Murray, this is just like the best book. It's my favorite book. I love this bit that I went to Hooker Falls and I saw the water, or, oh, I'm going to go and visit the Urewera Forest because I just love your story. I love, I'm going to come and visit Rotorua because you wrote about it and I love it. I love that people say that, they saw themselves in my writing. One of my publishers say that, my work with Dan Raybutts on the Path of Ra series, there is no other Maori, Asian, Kiwi writing duo in the world that, that's unique, and we were offering a new perspective that hadn't been seen before. That's special when you can say we wrote something and we told a story that hadn't been told before. And there are no new stories, but there are always new angles on stories. And my best work is still to come. It's always still to come. I'm always looking to that. I'm still wanting to do something special and innovative and new. And my best work is still to come. And I hope it will be the next one or the next one or the next one. I always want to improve on that. So there's that element of learning and striving to tell something in a new and fresh and original way. And I want to write the book that people can't put down. And, oh, my God, it's come to an end. When are you writing more? I have a few people in my messages saying, please, when are you going to write another Tane McKenna story? I need another Tane McKenna story. Or Tane McKenna is my book boyfriend, or, just those when you step up and you get an award and you just think, well, how did they choose me? I mean, well, I know the process, but like, it's still unbelievable to me that you get that recognition from your peers and readers. It's just having the privilege of telling your stories is just huge. So I just, for all the downsides, I think it's just the best job in the world. I'm super grateful. I'm working on some film work now, which is, so every step of the way there's something new. I moved into poetry from prose. I'm doing some more essays. And now film. I'm doing some screenplays. So there's just so much interesting, fun stuff. I'm also, a mentor, and I get to work with new writers coming through and help them shape their work. That's incredibly exciting to have that sneak peek, if you like, into someone else's process and their exciting stories coming through. As an editor, I get to help work with people and shape their stories and maybe give them their start in their writing career and being able to tell their stories. So I feel really privileged about that too. And that's actually really important to me. So later this year, I'm putting out an anthology of horror stories from New Zealand writers. So just New Zealand horror writers, as a sort of showcase, because I want people to see just what we're capable of and just how our landscape and our people and our culture sort of has its own urban myths and legends and some really spooky stuff that we can tap into. So I'm just really excited about that. So that makes me feel warm and, gooey. A horror writer that feels warm and gooey. I mean, it's weird, isn't it, to think that horror is a place for so much kindness and support and, but raising voices and everybody being represented and having a say. And so because diversity is so important, and everyone should have a say, not just the people that get the say, but everybody should be able to have, their story told and be heard and be seen. And if that means reading a book where there is an Asian little Asian girl growing up in New Zealand, well, you know, if no one else is going to write it, then I'll write it. I'll write it for you. And I'm hoping that there'll be some little Asian girl out there who'll pick it up and read it and enjoy it and feel seen.
Yeah. That's a great segue into your legacy, if you like. The life, work and legacy is what this podcast is about. And I think you've touched on some stuff there that I think probably will be your legacy. What's the future look like? You've talked about, I mean, clearly you're still really excited and passionate about what it is that you do. You've won so many awards that I lost count when I was doing my bit of research. But where do you want to take this? Where do you want to go next? What does the future look like for Lee Murray?
I usually plan by the year. What's a successful writer? I usually plan by the year, and I usually have a little one word that I sort of choose for the year, like wanderlust or joy or kindness was one of my words, and that kind of got me in a lot of trouble because I ended up doing lots of work being kind and not being kind to myself and looking out for, creating boundaries around my own time and my own writing space. But what do I don't know, just more of the same, I think. I think I'm still not quite there. I think I would love to get in with a big publisher. I don't have a literary agent. We don't. There are a few in New Zealand, but generally those agents don't necessarily have contacts with the big horror genre publishers. I'd like to be in with a big publisher and maybe enjoy that being looked after a little bit more, perhaps. That said, I think that there's a lot to be said for small press, who have been amazing to me. Smaller publishers have been fantastic to me, willing to take on my work, support me. There's a little bit less downtime. There's lead time. So in a small press, often there's only 3 or 4 people doing all the work. There's the publisher and a couple of editors and maybe a publicist if you're lucky. But in a large press, there'll be lots of people doing that work and distributors and so you don't have to necessarily, maybe that saves you a bit of time. I don't know. I haven't been in a big press, so I don't really know. But it would be nice to be able to maybe do some book launches and book tours and that fun stuff. That said, I'm getting involved in some documentary work around horror writing, and I've been invited to be part of Madness in Writers, which is a series showcasing horror writers. And I think at the moment I might be the only one from outside of the US, so that's pretty exciting. So I don't know. The opportunities keep opening themselves up to me, and I'm just so grateful for everyone that comes along, and I just sort of grab them with open arms. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. The film thing was completely out of the blue. I'm a screenwriter on Grafted, which is this body horror, weird science, social commentary, Asian, Kiwi, all New Zealand film being filmed right now in Auckland with Sacha Rainbow, who is a BAFTA-nominated director. So that's in production now, and I'm just really excited to have had a chance to be involved with that. And that was just sheer luck, really, because Murray Francis, who is the producer, happened to buy a book called A Clear Dawn, which was an anthology by Paula Morris and Alison Wong out of Auckland University Press, and with stories and perspectives from Asian writers in New Zealand. And I wasn't in that book. They didn't discover me till well after the book was pretty much done. But they wrote a line about me in the foreword and said, and Lee Murray, I can't remember the words, but something like making waves in genre fiction. So Murray Francis, the producer who read this in the foreword, rushed to see who I was and found my website and went, oh, well, here's someone who's a scientist, who knows about horror and also is Asian and a woman, and well, maybe we should get her on board to help bring Sasha's perspective, to the script. And so that was just completely out of the blue. So what's in store for me? Probably some other amazing things like that I don't know. So I'm manifesting them now so that they happen, because what a chance for me to have, to be able to work with a team like this and be involved in my first feature film. And, and it's horror. It's all the things I love. It's a fox spirit story. So it looks at Asian, mythology as how it might apply here in New Zealand. And so I'm super, super excited about the future. I'd like to retire sometime because, as I said, I'm getting close to 60 and maybe retire sometime, but not anytime soon because too much is happening.
Still young. Is that what's happening now with these connections? Is that community that sense of community and networking that your parents kind of showed you the way and influenced you? Is that what's paying a dividend is not the right
term. It is.
But do you know what I mean? Is it coming back to you, that kind of stuff?
Totally is. Yeah, totally is. I think so. If you were, look, here's a little example. I volunteered to help with the committee of StokerCon, which is the International Horror Writers Association annual conference. And I volunteered and I said, I don't know what I can do from over here in New Zealand, but if you need me to help, I'm happy to help. And they said, could you organise all the readings, the author readings? Because they have run a stream where everybody gets to read for 15, people can step forward to read for 15 minutes from their work, which is a great thing because there's nothing like hearing an author read from their own work because they put all the inflection in. You really get a feel for their characters. And so I said, I can do that, They had a program that they were using, and he said, we'll get all the people who request it, and we'll have this many slots, and if you could just kind of organise it, that we'd be grateful. And look, everybody had to contact me. And so I had a little conversation with 60 or 70 writers, and I matched emerging writers with more established writers so that the emerging writers got an audience because the established writers will bring the readership, the people to come to hear them. And depending, maybe mixed, paired people according to what they were choosing to read, talked a little bit about their work. So I had all these conversations with, 60 or 70 or 80, I can't remember how many I assigned. And, I was the person, I was just the volunteer, but and then I got to meet them, and then I went to some of those readings, and I got to meet those people when I went to, so I'm sure that some of them read me as a result, and now I know them, and they're part of my community, and they might think of me for anthologies, or they might reach out to me for an endorsement when they put their work out, and so there's the community, and that's just from hey, can I help? So while I didn't do it because I wanted something, I got something. I got this massive community of 60 odd, not everybody came up to me afterwards, but I had conversations with 60 or 70 people, and most of them I didn't know. So, go figure.
Yeah.
It's not about what's in it for me, but actually you always get more back than you put in. So, and then I got, sneak previews of what people were going to read and got to have discussions with them just online, but wonderful. And it's just a tiny thing.
Great experience. So with you talking about not planning beyond a year, from what you've just described there, it's not necessarily thinking ahead of some huge, great big goal or achievement. It sounds to me like you're just enjoying the journey.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I would like to write another novel. I haven't written one for about 3 or 4 years now. I've been sort of focused on expanding my skills in poetry and screenwriting and writing a lot more short stories and that kind of thing. So I would like to get back and write a novel because I feel that's my core. Those meatier stories are my core. Yeah, I'm just enjoying the ride. You're right. it's not what you should do, right? I mean, really, to succeed, you should plan, you should, manifest a goal in the future. But I want to be the best writer I can be. And I think some ways it's taking the opportunities that present themselves. Maybe I need to step back a bit more from the community, but then it's hard to because they've been so there for me and they've been the source of my success, I think. The community, all the communities, the local writing community has been hugely, hugely supportive of me. Tauranga writers, the speculative fiction community here in New Zealand have been, extremely supportive of me. So, it's harder to break into the literary, the mainstream community here, partly because we don't have publishers of horror here. But really, I think, more of the same. I just, more of the same, I think. And just see what comes. I can't wait to see what's coming.
Yeah, that's great. I'm reminded of a book I read by Sir Ken Robinson called The Element. He talks about when you're in that sweet spot of doing what you love and what you're really good at. Most of us either do one or the other. Whether do what we're good at, but we don't really love it, or we do what we love, but we're not necessarily really good at it. It seems to me that you are in your element.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm probably a better editor than I am a writer, an author. I don't know. It just seems to be that I end up doing a lot of editing projects, and maybe that's because they're a little easier for me than the actual writing. I don't know. So my goal is always to be a writer as opposed to an editor, but a lot of the community work is involved around editing. And when I say editing, there's a bigger concept. It's not just looking at the words. So editing is also curating, convening, bringing together the right combination of people, working around how to lead the reader through through a series of stories or pieces of work in order to create a journey through the book. So there's more to being an editor than, they just check the words and the punctuation and the spelling. So I just want to put that out there because I know that there are some different ideas about what an editor is, or they're just the editor. But if you are the editor of your name is on the cover of the book as an editor, not I edited this novel before it went out, but the name on the cover editor, so an anthologist, in fact, that is a bigger, more involved process than just editing, if you like. It's there's no such thing as just editing. Everybody needs an editor, but it's not just the copy edit type work, and I feel like that has been a lot of my community building is around those projects, putting out work by young New Zealand writers, putting out work by the speculative fiction group of New Zealand. I've done some anthologies for that group, and also Asian Women in Horror. So I've done some work around mental health and horror. So those community projects usually involve editing, and so they're probably not entirely true because when I write a story, I often write them for those kinds of projects as well. So which build community. Things like, for example, the Pixel Project, I gave a free story to them. And that book's it's called Giving the Devil Its Due, and it's basically a book to raise awareness of violence against women. So there again, a big community of people coming together to raise awareness around an issue. So although my real goal has always been to be an author, editing tends to be the area where it consumes a lot of my time because those are those community projects, and writing my own novels and my own books and stories tends to be more solitary insofar as writing is solitary, which it is not. But I'm not making much sense. I'm talking gibberish, but but my real goal is not to be an editor, I guess, but I am. But my real goal was always to be a writer first and an editor second.
Yeah.
So
I've got one last question. or maybe I should have asked this earlier, maybe, but I don't want to not ask it. So you talked earlier, very early on in our conversation, about not sort of regretting decisions that were made, or not following advice of your parents. There's no regrets around that kind of thing. And you also talked about, everything that you've done. And I think I use the term building blocks. I'm putting words in your mouth here, but it's like the building blocks to where you are today. Is there any kind of regret, or is there any way that you would look back and say to Lee a bit earlier in life, because of how you love and enjoy and you're passionate about the writing, once you made that leap into that, once you got that permission and once you took that step, you've never looked back. Is there an element that you wish you maybe had done that sooner?
I think I would be a different writer. So maybe not. Maybe I needed that maturity. You don't see many prodigy writers, do you? I mean, math and science and some of those professions, you can have a prodigy, right? You can have a music, but with writing, it's all about life experience and exploring things that are important to us and resonate, and that requires some I'm not saying that young people can't do that, but what I'm saying is I felt maybe I needed that life experience in order to
draw on,
it, and in order to make the kinds of progress that I have, or to tell the kinds of stories that I've told. So but I don't think people should wait. I just think, for me, it just happened that way. I mean, I can't go back. I don't have a control Lee that I can sort of say, well, I should have started over here and it would have turned out better. I'm very happy with the way that it's going. I'm very fortunate. But if I had my time again, would I start earlier? I don't know. I don't know. Like you say, building blocks and everything contributes, in some ways to how you see the world. So would I have done it differently? No, I don't know. Don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. I'm not going to regret it. I'm really happy with the way it's going. And I don't think if I hadn't done science, I'm also a Waikato girl. If I hadn't done science, that I would be writing the kinds of things I'm writing. So,
great. Okay, thank you.
No regrets. Happy.
Good. Yeah, that's good. Lee, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and all the things that you've got on the go. I appreciate you sharing your story with us, should I say. And congratulations on all the awards that you've got. I'm sure there are many more ahead. Whatever the future looks like, I'm sure you'll be extremely successful, continue to be extremely successful. I've learned a lot from listening to you today. I'm sure lots of other people will too. So I thank you for that. I've got great insight into what it's like to be an author, the work of an author, and what goes into it. And so that's been really valuable. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Sam, and for asking those gnarly questions. No, I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much for asking.
That's great. Thank you very much. Cheers. As you will hopefully know by now, if you've seen other episodes, this segment of the podcast is all about wisdom worth sharing from our guests who are living a life that is a story worth retelling. At the end of every interview, I look back as part of the editing process and discover some of the gems that came out during the conversation, and I summarise them here. Firstly, I'm sure you'll agree that the conversation with Lee was wonderful. What an amazingly inspirational lady she is. With her high levels of energy, I just found that to be infectious. I could have listened to her all day. It was literally like she was telling me a story, which isn't always the case in these episodes. Lee has such a passion about writing and editing, a passion for storytelling. She's clearly found her element, and she's living it every day. Something many of us wish we could do. Lee told us that she'd wanted to be a writer since growing up with her storytelling dad, telling stories in the car, not only encouraging her and her siblings to get involved in those stories, but also probably encouraging them to read and disappear into great books. When she had proclaimed she wanted to be a writer at the age of 10 years old, her dad advised her that she needed to get a real job first, something that a young person could have easily taken offense to, sulked about, and lost her enthusiasm for a dream. But she didn't do any of that. She trusted her father, trusted his advice, and followed it without question. And clearly that paid a dividend, because as Lee states, it's not that young people can't write good stories, far from it. But the wisdom that comes from experience, it's that helps achieve a different level of authentic storytelling. And that often comes with years. When the time was right, Lee took the plunge. Now, it wasn't an easy choice. She needed the backup and support of her husband, and let's say, it's fair to say, she needed a nudge from him too. He'd probably had enough of Lee talking about becoming a writer and not actually taking the steps to achieve it. And life's a bit like that, isn't it? When I talked about Lee being in her element, doing something she loves and is clearly good at, we're often not sure what our element is. Maybe fear, which is what Lee writes about, is the thing that prevents us from opening up and admitting to ourselves what our element could be. And in turn, we never obtain the support and backing to help make that decision, to take that plunge. And what are we missing out on? Well, I think as adults, we tend to listen to all the no's we've had across our lives and immediately dismiss the plunge as ridiculous and far-fetched. But that's possibly where happiness lies. Despite being an author, not paying well, Lee feels that her job is the best in the world. So clearly it's not just all about money. On a different note, Lee discussed the topic of representation. I have to say, this got me thinking, not just during the interview, but ever since. I've been somewhat ignorant about this until now, but when Lee spoke of being a child growing up in New Zealand, where there weren't many kids like her with mixed-race parents, she didn't see herself or anyone looking like her anywhere. And that wasn't just in the playground at school. On TV, in books, magazines, papers, anywhere. She wasn't represented. Now, Lee says it's getting much better, of course, these days, but there's still a way to go. This is why it's important for Lee to be recognised and acknowledged as a female Asian horror writer, paving the way for future generations to tell their stories. Another important lesson Lee shared with us was the influence of both her parents in demonstrating a sense of community. They were involved in everything for their own interests, running clubs and the like, as well as those of their children. If there was a need to be on a committee or a working group, or just turning up and volunteering on the day, they were there. This taught Lee that being an active member of the community was important. And she's grown up with these values, and interestingly, it served her well, despite not doing these things for the purpose of seeking a return. And at this point, I was reminded of the interview with Emeritus Professor David McKee, where he talked about his philosophy of giving more than he receives, but that he was finding it hard to achieve. Neither Lee nor David are the kind of people who would ever give in order to receive, far from it. But it seems that the benefits of being willing to give are numerous. Lee became emotional when she described that her award for being a mentor would have been the biggest thing her father would have been proud of her for, which shows how important serving the community is to Lee and her family. The final point I want to discuss from Lee's interview was the presence of imposter syndrome. As Lee advised, she'd suffered from anxiety and depression for most of her life, but didn't know what it was until her diagnosis when she was 50. Clearly, this plays a role, especially when, as Lee described, writing is the industry of rejection. Despite writing so many books, essays, poems, and being an editor for so many pieces of work, every time Lee sits down to write, she feels like she's an imposter. Who is she to write a novel? It just shows that winning all of those awards certainly hasn't gone to her head, and her humility is still intact. Lee said that this has actually served her to an extent. It helps her keep grounded and also drives her to improve her craft each time she dives into another piece of work. Maybe a little bit of self-doubt is beneficial for all of us in preventing overconfidence creeping in. Despite feeling the way she does, it's not prevented Lee from doing what she loves. It takes courage to overcome anxiety, depression, and keeping a lid on the imposter syndrome, especially in a career where rejection is expected. She's not just persisted, but she's excelled. And maybe overcoming those things were what she needed for her own personal journey, but also to be the very best that she can be. And who knows, it may have helped her become the award-winning author that she is today. Hopefully you've been able to take many insights away from this interview that you can apply to some aspect of your work, life, and legacy. Use it. Share it with others. As I always say, sharing is like teaching, and teaching helps us retain what we've learned and commit to change, which of course is necessary if we are to enhance our own life's work. I hope that you're happy, safe, and successful in all that you do. And remember, live a life that's a story worth retelling. I'm Steve Worsley, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Life's Work, the podcast all about wisdom worth sharing.